Okay, so we got this issue now of Brexit, and it's a interesting question. If you look at the results, 51.9% voted to leave. That's 17,410,742 votes to leave, and 48.1 voted to stay. 16,141,241 votes. Um, It's a difference of about 1,298,000 votes, give or take, which is about the population of Birmingham. Um, it's not a hugely significant in terms of decision kind of vote. If you look at the national graph, you'll see that it is mostly a swathe of Middle Britain that has decided out, and uh, often the rural areas, the Scotland, much of Northern Ireland, um, London, the home counties, to an extent along the Reading and Slough corridor out towards uh, out towards Cardiff, Scotland, some of the city areas in the northwest. Uh, that's about it, and of course the outlying islands that have to deal more regularly and more frequently with Europe. So it often seems that the more people deal with Europe, and European crossings and the benefits of the EU, the more they actually want to stay, which in many ways seems counterintuitive, um, especially given the text and the message of the EU, um, of the EU Leave campaign. If the EU was so bad, those with the greatest experience, the Liverpool, the London, the home counties, regions, um, the areas around the Irish borders, Scotland. Um, it looks like, if I look at the South Hams, actually a kind of a close one, but um, if you look around at the regions, you'll see that most of the ones that have the interaction are those with experience with the EU. That's more evident than anything, considering Gibraltar, as well as the Isles of the Shetland Islands with Denmark and other European countries, and the Isles of Scilly and places like that. Um, so that's not what you'd expect from the rhetoric of the Leave campaign. It does, in fact, seem that the referendum vote was more of a vote on the UK government rather than one on the strengths and merits of the EU itself, um, which is not entirely unexpected in this day and time, but not what people were asked to vote on. Um, so I asked for some questions, and I did get some questions, which we'll start with first. Um, and it is from Gary Holbrook at the University of Georgia in Athens, not that far away from me. For those that don't know, I'm a Scouser. I'm from Liverpool, but I've lived in Georgia for the last 10, 12 years or so. My hometown voted stay, quite rightly too, even though a friend of mine, a guy I've known most of my life, my local councillor and leader of the UK Liberal Party, Steve Radford, was a um, fervent Leave campaigner. Um, but Gary asks, could the result of the EU ref usher in an era of brain drain from the UK as younger people there decide to move elsewhere in search of better economic opportunity? Good question, and almost certainly it may well lead to yes. Young people generally voted in favour of remaining. Um, most elderly people voted to leave because the campaign resonated with what we might say is the inherent racial contingent of immigrants, but also it tried to harken back to a time of Great Britain, um, and tried to stir a fervent nationalism, pushing back to the pre-75 era when it we before the EU. Um, this is the thing. People born since then, and that was 41 years ago. Anybody under 41 will have been in the EU all their lives, effectively. I mean, I'm 36. I've known the EU all my life. It's what we're used to, and I have some experience and some knowledge of the EU, thanks to past experiences, and yes, it does give fantastic opportunities. The ability to travel between countries. I work with a Dutch company, and that's incredibly easy to do because the UK and the Netherlands are in a joint in the EU, so it makes it very simple. Another one of my co-workers is also British, and it with the UK and the Netherlands being so close, that's a real easy thing to do. Post Brexit, who knows? It may be that I'm not so badly affected being in the US, but my co-worker who's still in the UK, he may well have to leave to go to the Netherlands, or indeed the company may have to in the future. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen or if anything's going to happen, but if it goes as expected, it may be that there'll be a whole lot more paperwork, a whole lot more taxes, tariffs, etc., and it may be not cost effective for my colleague to work at that company, or it may not be cost effective for the company to keep him on. So he may move to stay with the job, or it may be that the UK will lose that income. We don't know. But as companies will want to leave the EU, well, rather leave the UK to stay in the EU, then job opportunities go, and so the young people will have to follow the jobs. It's reminiscent of the 80s when you had things like Auf Wiedersehen Pet. Northern people working in places like Germany because that's where the jobs were. So, Boys from the Black stuff. Again, it was all about migratory working across the European Union. That was a big flavour and a big theme of the 80s. So, do I think it'll be more migration? Yes, if it actually goes through, and we do, and the UK does leave the EU. Last time I checked, about 2 hours ago, it hadn't yet. David Cameron had not travelled to Brussels, or yes, Brussels, because it has to go to the Commission, and initiated Protocol 50 or Section 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which is the Leave Protocol. But if and when he does, and in the up to 2 years following the leave, then yes, I can see companies leaving, I can see things happening, and I can see people starting to move towards moving to Europe. So I hope that answered that question for you, Gary. But I don't know if you're there. Um, yeah. Next question he asked was, what is and are the most likely generations for the putative generation of expatriates? Canada, the US, somewhere else? To stay, the US is not exactly in a good spot itself right now, obviously with Trump. So I'd hold off on saying they'd go to the US. Canada is a possibility. Certainly, being a Commonwealth country, it is a bit easier for British to go to Canada than it is to, say, the United States or elsewhere. Um, Trying to remain in the EU while they're still in the EU, that's another possibility, of course. Those who are old enough to remember, there was when Hong Kong left British control and went to Chinese control, there was the option for people in Hong Kong to get British passports and stay British, and the same has happened with many other territories in the past. So there may be an option, just may, that the EU will allow British citizens who want to be and remain an EU citizen to move to another country and sort of do an easy move to another country and effectively change their nationality. That's a possibility. I've not heard it floated anywhere yet. I have no idea how feasible it is, but that's another possibility, is that there may be a move to Europe. Um, Although the difficulty is knowing what the situation will be for British nationals post in the EU post actual exit. Um, so yeah, moving to the US is actually really hard for British people, even if you're desired. I have a friend I've worked on the Muon One project with for 10, 12 years now. He is a nuclear physicist, particle physicist, who worked at the Rutherford Appleton Laboratory outside Oxford. Got his PhD and everything else. He moved to the Brookhaven National Labs in Long Island, New York, and was on a work visa. And this is a national lab, government-owned particle physics lab doing research for the government, and it's still not exactly easy for him to switch over to being a permanent resident. He was on a visa last time I spoke to him, and his time on that visa was almost up, and so they'd have to decide whether to let him stay permanently or not. Excuse me. It was a late night last night, getting the results, and obviously a very sleepless night afterwards. Um, so, and Gary gave me a third question. What are the main foreseeable unintended consequences of the Leave vote? Could enough young talent leave the UK such that it may be forced to rely on immigrant talent, thus ironically leading to greater influx of immigrants at a longer run? I don't know about unintended consequences. Foreseeable unintended consequences is in many ways sort of an oxymoron. But let's think about it this way. The Leave campaign said there'd be no economic worries. Well, the pound crashed 10% of its value against the dollar just in hours last night. Questions on trading. Japanese trading, I think, was halted because of uncertainty and economic crashes. The FTSE 100 dropped to about under 6,000 last week. I remember when 6,003 was its all-time high, and that was 18 years ago, almost exactly. So Brexit pretty much wiped, or at least a threat of Brexit, wiped out any stock market gains in the FTSE over the last 18 years, which is great going, guys. No economic problems except for all of them. And following on, places like GM has said it's considering pulling out of certain plants, things like the Ellesmere Port plant near Liverpool, which makes the Astra for Vauxhall and for Opel, and I don't know if they carry it here in the US as they used to as under the Saturn brand, but then closed Saturn. So I don't know if they do or not under another brand. I can't really say I've looked, but it makes no sense for them to make a car in the UK to try and sell to Europe, and that's going to add extra taxes. It may be greater economically to move to Europe, and ironically, one of the things the Leave campaign has been touting, and I wrote about it on my site earlier this week, was that they would be no economic consequences from leave, said the Vauxhall chairman 9 months ago. Of course, last week GM said it wouldn't make much sense to stay in Britain following a leave move, and other companies have said the same. Nissan apparently wrote to all their employees up and around Sunderland. And if you grew up in the 80s, you remember all the big adverts about how great Sunderland was and how the new Nissan car plant was a paragon of virtue and forward thinking. So it's a little odd to see them touting no economic issues when there are going to be huge economic issues. And could enough talent leave the UK to make them rely on things? Rely on them for what? I mean, it was mainly the unskilled and I hate to say less educated, but those with a lower level of formal education that voted more for the leave, and the jobs that are going to be left are going to be tending more towards those kinds of jobs anyway. The high education, high tech companies that want to sell worldwide, or at least Europe-wide, are going to be leaving, so why are they going to need those kind of jobs from immigrants? And with the recessions that will probably follow, then there's going to be a lot more low-income jobs which foreigners and local people can fill just as easily, especially with the growing reliance on things like zero-hour contracts, which are not an EU thing. In fact, zero-hour contracts are a way to get around EU laws to fulfil a desire and a need from the UK government, and especially the right wings of Boris and the like, to get a cheap, low-cost labour solution. So I don't think they're going to need to rely on that many labourers, because it's going to be an economic slump similar to that of Greece, perhaps. So, are there any more questions? Any more comments? It's, if you got them, send them to me. Email, Twitter at Tetch, or otherwise, or just in the live chat here at the bottom. One of the big problems with Brexit is that it's not going to go and make things better as claimed, and part of that was in how it was presented. In many ways, it seems, talking to people, that they thought it was going to be they decided to treat it as a referendum on the UK government rather than that of the EU government and governance and setup. So it's a curious way of dealing with things. I mean, they wanted people sort of as a protest vote, as a way of showing Westminster that they don't like what's happening. Yet last year, when they had the chance to do such a thing, they mainly just carried on voting in pretty much the same ways they have done for a while. So they weren't exactly protesting very much, except perhaps they don't like their own choices now. We're seeing the same sort of thing in the US as well with the Trump vote. In many ways, this Brexit vote is the UK version of the Trump vote. And I know the UK has been making fun of Trump for months and months and months. But we've made it happen ourselves, guys, and that's not great, not smart. Excuse me. So how do we go? Where do we? It's. I can't wait to see what. Well, Have I Got News for You's finished now, but I can't wait to see what the likes of Mock the Week can do. Thank you. Yeah, it's dry air here with the air conditioning going, and talking non-stop makes my throat a bit dry and scratchy. Um, Gary here in the comments asks, is there a chance a later vote could undo this? Well, this being the EU referendum is not, despite what many people think, it's not actually a binding vote. It doesn't mean anything directly of itself. It doesn't compel anybody to do anything, and it does not actually start into motion the EU referendum. What it does is it sends a message that certain areas want certain things, but if desired, the Conservative Party could ignore the vote and just carry on as normal. It's possible. But could it be reversed at a later date? Yes. One of the options is that it could go to a parliamentary vote. It seems that most of the Conservatives are for stay. All of the MPs are actually for stay. So that's one way that it could get out, but it would be in many ways political suicide for those MPs, because at least to do it right now, if they put it off a couple of months, let the reality sink in. I mean, already things like the London Standard have shown videos of people regretting, saying, yes, we voted to leave yesterday. Now we've already seen the results that we were told weren't going to happen, and oh my god, I wish we could go back yesterday and change our minds. It's not unlikely that there may be another vote, but who knows? There's many things. Cameron could, as I say, go to Brussels tomorrow and initiate Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty and pull it out. He could go for a parliamentary vote, which could actually be rejected by the House of Lords, which might be a very amusing thing, that to save itself from the alleged from a vote that reeked of on undemocratic EU. Let's put aside the fact that the EU is actually more democratic than the UK government setup, but to have an unelected upper house save the UK from a mistake that alleged it was about more democracy is in many ways incredibly ironic, and would be a amusing way to maybe salvage some of the issues. But it's a difficult way to move on. And I said, the longer it's drawn out a bit, if Cameron's promised to step down by October, if say he just holds off on having a vote or a parliamentary vote until October, and then lets that be one of the aspects, and say diplomatically leaves that to the new Prime Minister, whoever it may be, to have the vote as one of their first votes, then it may be that in the 3.5 months or so, 3 months, 3.5 months until that time, the economic realities and the fact that the sunshine, rainbows, kittens, and unicorns promised by the Leave campaign haven't come true, and can cause people to embrace a parliamentary vote that denies this thing. So yes, there's definitely a chance that later votes could undo this in many ways. Especially as it seems like there's a kind of drunken regret. I mean, you get drunk, you do crazy things. It seems great at the time, but when you wake up in the morning, you regret that hangover that you're left with. So that's where we are right now. Is there anybody got any more questions? I can. If you got questions, just type them out, bang them out. It's all good for me. Um, to go to other issues with the thing, immigration is a big one. Most immigration isn't EU based. Leaving the EU won't fix the immigration yet. That was what a lot of people were talking about. Um, and to see some of the things, I mean, I talked to some people just before I decided to do this, and one of the things I said was we're going to deal with all the immigration and stuff, and that's why I did it. But this isn't going to solve the immigration. It's not going to solve the issues at heart because it can't. Boris has said, yeah, it's not about getting rid of Johnny Foreigner and stuff. It's not about. I think it's about controlling immigration. Well, the EU never impacted immigration and immigration law. Particularly, it was more of a people who are in Europe can move freely within Europe. Any more than people in Spain can get annoyed about all those British people living there. I mean, you hate thinking of yourself as Johnny Foreigner, but look at poor Gibraltar. Spain's already started to pounce on it. People who are living there want to be British, are British. British base, a strategically important base in many ways. There's been high tensions with Spain there for many, many years, and it was, I believe, 95% or so in favour of remaining. And Spain had already threatened them earlier this week that they'd kind of take over the borders and control them. 10,000 people a day go through those borders, and if I very, very quickly look up Gibraltar, what is its population? Its population is 30,000, so 1 in 3 people, one third of the population of Gibraltar, go through the Gibraltar border to Spain every single day. And it's not a big territory, and the approach even into Gibraltar Airport is not exactly the easiest one. I mean, it's well known for being a difficult one. It's got a rock. The Spanish restrict flights over their own airspace for those landing in Gibraltar because they see it as a contentious territory. So those flying into Gibraltar generally have to fly in over the sea and across the turbulent air, hitting the rock and land on the airport. And what many people don't realise is there's actually a main road that goes right across the runway. And of course, if you don't make your landing first time, you have to go around. Well, then you're going to hit Spanish airspace, and that's going to cause more issues and problems and possible fines and stuff. So it's not like those 30,000 people are going to be any better off. I mean, a lot of it's going to be extremely difficult and hard for them. And a British territory may end up being severely punished, to put it bluntly, by the Spanish for the result of this vote of people in I don't know, Middle England. Let's pick a place at random from the map. People in, say, Shropshire. Yeah, let's say Shropshire. Well, so people in Shropshire saying we don't like the idea of those darkies coming on. We don't like the idea that the EU should maybe issue guidelines on flame retardants of fabrics. How dare they? It's not. It's people thinking out for themselves and their own selfish ideas and prejudices, rather than actually looking at the bigger picture, the better picture, and the future. Okay, Gary's asked another question. How is the pro-Leave campaign funded? I'm not familiar with GB parliamentary systems, to what extent that money is speech influence the vote. Referendums are different from elections. In elections, you have it's actually quite a strict system by comparison to in the US. In the US, you can spend pretty much anything you want as a campaign that the campaign funds. Candidates can give the campaigns as much as they want of their own money, or loan it, as Donald Trump has done, which can be paid back by the time of the convention. Um, but um, super PACs, outside groups, can spend as much as they want, thanks to Citizens United, as long as they don't um, coordinate with the campaign, which it seems many have done. And non-profit organisations like the Trump Foundation, the Clinton Foundation, can't actually engage in politics themselves, which is why when I was head of the Pirate Party and working with the Pirate Party, it was often very, very difficult for me to work with groups like the Electronic Frontiers Forum, Electronic Frontier Foundation, sorry, and Access Now, and other such groups like Demand Progress, because they were all non-profit charities. And they can't engage in political work, and so coordinating with a political party is difficult and risky to their tax status. In the UK, it's not like that at all for elections. And for elections, and I've helped work with a few of them, with the Pirate Party and others. Um, you have a set number of funding. Um, you can fundraise yourself, and there are donation limits, and above a certain donation limit, you have to report the donation. I think it's £500, but you have to give a weekly accounting of your spending to the Electoral Commission when you're campaigning, if I remember rightly. I had a treasurer for this. We had a treasurer for this, and he dealt with a lot of that, and as I wasn't actually a candidate or a campaign manager, I didn't get involved in nitty-gritty on this. But I believe the limit per MP's campaign is £30,000. If you contrast that to, say, a representative for the U.S. House of Representatives, they tend to run about $2 to $3 million, or that's I would say that was about £1 million, but that was before last night. It's now about 1.3, 1.4 million pounds. Yes, the pound dropped that much in many ways, but 30,000 is all, and you only campaigns are generally really, really quick. Last year, the 2015 election, we knew it was coming because it hadn't come sooner, and because there was an act of Parliament passed following the establishment of the coalition government, saying that they wouldn't call a snap election, which has happened in the past. The last time the turnout was bigger than this was back in 1951, when Prime Minister Clement Attlee called a snap general election because he figured that he'd get more seats than the four he had at that time, and he'd gotten in a general election just 9 months earlier. It turned out he figured wrong, and he lost, and Winston Churchill won, became Prime Minister again. But parliamentary terms are for up to 5 years, and even now they can, with a majority of Parliament, they can decide to have a new election. So you get roughly 30 days notice, unless you know it's going to go to the end date. So you get much less of a campaign time. The US presidential election, by comparison, has had 2 years now of campaigning in some instances. 1 year straight for Donald Trump. For example, Hillary Clinton's been campaigning almost for 3 years, it seems. But so you get that short time frame. So money isn't a huge influencer in British politics, because you don't have the time. You actually have spending limits. Now, a referendum are a little different. I'm not entirely sure on the amount, but I believe they have. They still have to do detailed accounting of what they spend on, but there aren't the limits on it that there are on a general election and on an election. But you can spend whatever you can bring in. I believe I can look up some figures right quick. while I'm talking. Uh, as to what the prices and that are. Um, let's see. Um, here's some BBC had some funding things. The official campaign for Britain to stay in the EU, Britain Stronger in Europe, raised 6.9 million, which is more than twice as much as Vote Leave's 2.8 million. But all the Leave campaigns together raised 8.2 million pounds, higher than Remain's 7.5 million total. So, if you think about it like that, that's what 15.7 million pounds, $20 million. That's barely a Senate campaign. So funding is a much smaller issue, certainly in Britain, and there's a lot more door-to-door knocking and going around telling people what thing. A lot more local things and rallies. There's less glitzy TV adverts, and massive TV campaign spending. Often because, for a start, one of the most watched channels in the UK doesn't have adverts, the BBC. So the money as speech isn't exactly as big a thing. It's not such a great thing in the UK as in the US. Probably for the better, but it still doesn't mean you can't get stupid, ignorant votes based on lies and fallacies. Um, So it's quite interesting to see the heat map of votes, which revealed the political leanings of different parts of England as a country. Brown states versus blue states. Yeah, it's it's that sort of dichotomy between young areas, old areas. Money, those are money, those without. I saw and I commented when I ran my live blog last night that one of the Leave Labour campaigners, Labour MPs, said that you could tell all the Remain places because they're the places with all the money. They're the ones making all the money. Whereas all the Remain areas were the poor areas where people are fed up and they don't want to keep sending their money to Europe. One of the problems with that is that my hometown, Liverpool, contains three of the poorest areas in the UK. Three of the top 10 poorest areas in the UK. Where I grew up was one of them. The Kensington, Stonecroft area, and it was at one point in the 80s. It was the second most economically deprived area in the EU when I was a kid, beating rural Sicily. Beaten by rural Sicily. So they voted Remain, possibly because over the last 10 to 15 years, the UK's had a huge regeneration from the EU, which has turned around Liverpool as a city in many ways, while the UK government has instead ignored and abandoned Liverpool as the Tories are wont to do, and those old enough will remember things like the poll tax riots and in all the troubles in Toxteth and the Hillsborough incident and the dismissive response of the Tory government at the time, Margaret Thatcher, and how hard it had to be fought then to get kind of justice and things, because the law and order aspect of the government was backing the police all the way. So they focused a lot on Manchester. But Liverpool voted to remain, and they're not exactly a rich area. In fact, a lot of the poorest areas of the UK voted to stay. I also noticed while I was just looking up the EU funding thing that Cornwall, which voted to leave. Let me just pull up Cornwall's figures. Um, Cornwall voted 56 leave, 43.5% remain. 77% turnout. Good. 3 out of 4 people eligible to vote in Cornwall went to vote, and it's not exactly a easy to vote area. And it's rural and it's spread out. And I used to spend my summers down there in Bodmin, so I know Cornwall a fair bit. But it was 42,125 votes more towards Leave than Remain, and yet Cornwall gets a lot of funding from the EU because it's a rural area, and then it's often economically deprived, and it's a um, got no real industries anymore. A lot of the industries that they did have were not old-fashioned industries, farming and textiles and fishermen and so on. Um, and now uh, they want to keep their EU subsidies, and it's quite interesting that they're going to suddenly get what they voted for, but then realise that it's not what they actually wanted, not what they thought it was going to be, and not it's the cold sobering truth of waking up and realising you've made a big mistake last night when drunk. Okay, another question from London has a strong blue area right next to a strong brown area. Economic incongruity, inequality explaining. To an extent, yes, there are rich areas of London, some really rich areas, the Chelseas and so on. And there are some poor areas. Tower Hamlets springs to mind as often an area that often has rich and poor next to each other. And I once filmed a TV show, Spaced, with Simon Pegg. In Hackney, and going to places that are rat infested to film it. And this was right underneath a car park in the centre of London, and there were people working on cars right around the corner. In a rat infested kind of underground, under the arches sort of thing. And it was not nice, and it was an eye opener in many ways. Nicholas, how many languages can I speak? I can read generally most of the time when I've had sleep and my brain's functioning fully. A bunch. I can write probably about the same number, but not very well, and about as well as I can listen to them, and I can speak them. Heck, I have trouble speaking English most of the time, so it's not quite a question of being functionally literate and fluent in many languages, but I can get by and read at least at times French, Spanish, Italian, Welsh, Dutch, German, Swedish, Portuguese, and Klingon. But that's mainly because I've sort of picked them up working with a lot of things in and around Europe over the last 15 years. Except the Klingon, I learnt that. I actually got that for a birthday present 20 years ago today. I decided to learn it, and yes, Klingon jet. Dry mouth is a terrible thing for trying to speak Klingon. As Michael Dorn says in the introduction things, expectoration or spitting is normal with Klingon, and this kind of dry mouth doesn't help with that. But going back to looking at the future now, the question is going to be what is going to happen, and it's going to be interesting thing, especially for UKIP, for the UK Independence Party, whose leader, Nigel Farage, used to be a Tory MP until, I believe, the Maastricht Treaty of '91. He was a stockbroker initially, so he should have known the stock market would crash somewhat based on the Brexit result. Um, but the amusing thing about about UKIP is it has one MP in Westminster, but it has a bunch of MEPs, and it has had for a number of years, and that's because the way the EU votes its members of parliament is more democratic than the way the UK Parliament elects its MPs. The UK Parliament goes by a first past the post system in small constituencies, so with often 4, 5, 6 parties, sometimes as many as 8 or 10, you can end up winning the seat without a majority of the vote, only a plurality of votes. Sometimes it could be as low as 25-30% of the votes in the constituency. So Mr. Farage himself ran for a Member of Parliament seat and didn't actually win. He came in second. Whereas with the European Parliament, you're in larger regions. I think there's 9 regions, if I remember rightly. Each has multiple seats, and it's a proportional representation system using I can't remember the name of the voting method off the top of my head, but it's a proportional representation system, so they can get more seats for coming in second. So in that way, it's a lot more democratic because the votes are better represented in the people that they elect. I mean, Scotland has most of its MPs are SNP party, but as a percentage of the vote, UKIP got more votes than the SNP did across the whole of the UK. But UKIP has 1 seat, and the SNP has something like 23, maybe a bit more. So it was interesting in a way that UKIP said that the EU is undemocratic when, under the European parliamentary election system, that gives a better, more accurate number of seats based on the vote. So it becomes a better representation. The other interesting thing is that UKIP MEPs are some of both the worst attending MEPs of all and the most expensive MEPs of all, in that they take and they put on the highest levels of expenses as possible. And so a lot of the funding for UKIP actually comes from not just from Europe, but literally from the European Parliament is funding a lot of UKIP. And now that's with the Leave vote, Farage has actually planned to lose a lot of his party's income, which is a great short-term thing, especially because they could force a general election in the next week or two, so that by the end of July there'd be a general election, again the 30-day thing mentioned earlier, and then they might be likely to win some more seats in the British Parliament. But if they don't get this election, and the realities, the economic realities, and the promises that UKIP and the Conservative and Labour Leave campaigners have put up don't come true, and they don't materialise, and in fact everything the Remain camp said would happen if Leave was voted in happens, then they're going to lose a lot of their support and find themselves in a very difficult place to ever get re-elected. So that's going to be a problem again for them. And then it's a great short-term plan, but a terrible long-term plan for the party. Even though Farage has said that he's been campaigning on this for 25 years. Well, yeah, because certain people like to be a bigger fish in a smaller pond. Um, it's it's crazy in many ways. Um, so uh, I take it an independent Britain will have to negotiate trade agreements with the EU and all countries that were covered under the EU or species. Yeah, I actually wrote in detail about this earlier this week. There are procedures for negotiating trade deals. There's actually one in process with the EU right now, between the EU and the US. That's the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Act. Investment Partnership, sorry, not Act, called TTIP. It's been negotiating. It's been in negotiations for the past 3 years, and as I say, it's between the EU and the US. Now, if you look at the GDPs of both, they're both about the same, depending on whose figures you use. The International Monetary Fund has the EU, the high GDP. The UN has the US with the slightly higher GDP, and it it varies on whose figures and how they measure it. But they are effectively a negotiation between two fairly equal-sized countries. Now, again, as I say, 3 years they've been negotiating it. The 13th round of negotiation will be sometime next month in July, and we can't actually see the text of it. To see the text of it, you've got to be a MEP or a member of the US Senate. You have to go into a secured room. You are not allowed any aides. You are not allowed any assistance. You have to lock up your phone, any device capable of taking a picture, any device capable of scanning. You are given a sheet of paper with your name on top for which to make notes. You cannot leave the reading room, the locked reading room, with any of the documents from the trade agreement. So when you get the notes, when you're done, I'm not sure. Some people have said that you get to keep the notes you've handwritten. Others say you have to hand in those notes. So it's sure that's not the most democratic of things, but it's certainly not going to be a good thing for the people when trying to negotiate. But as I say, it's 3 years in. At that point, it's still not fully negotiated. Half the text is still at the proposal stage. Very little is actually finished. So expect another year or so of negotiations just to get the final text, and then and only then at that point can we see it. Once that's done, it would then go to the European Parliament to sign and to read, to have committees debate on it, issue recommendations on it. Then the European Parliament votes on it, and if it passes, then it would go to the the signing by the EU and all the member government heads of state, or is it the Council? It's one of the two, but they're often effectively one and the same. But then, once that happens, each member state has to ratify the agreement. And that can take a while. It took 2 years for the ratifications for the Lisbon Treaty, which is the reorganisation of the EU, and that was it. And that's for the second attempt. The first attempt started in 2001, went until 2004, and then it failed in the ratification in Ireland and one other country. So they actually had to scrap the whole thing and start all over again in 2007, and that gave to the they wrote the constitution for the Lisbon Treaty, what have you, really quick, in a couple of weeks, like 4 or 5 months or so, and then signed it the same year, and it still took 2 years to go through the ratification process before it came true. With the TTIP, that's going to take a similar amount of time, because that's typically the time for doing it. And the means of ratification by each country depends on the country. Some may go for a referendum like this, as Ireland did. Others may just say a parliamentary vote. But it depends on the country, and if one country does not want to sign it, if one country vetoes it, then it's a veto. So that's going to be the big problem with what's going to happen with this thing. Now the UK says it wants to negotiate a treaty. Well, for a start, the UK isn't the US. The US is a GDP of about 15 and a half, between 15 and a half and 17 million, compared to the UK's 2.5 to 2.8. So there's a big difference. The US and the EU, as I said, are roughly equal in GDP, including the UK. The difference between the EU and the UK is about a 7-to-1 ratio, especially as Germany is actually a bigger economy on its own than the UK. So we got that problem for a start, that the UK is not going to be in the best position to negotiate because it's a smaller guy trying to negotiate with a bigger guy. Secondly, the UK does about 45 to 50% of its trade with EU member states. That's not the case for those EU member states with the UK. Poland, for example, only does 5% of its trade with the UK. So any deal that's good for the UK's 50% has to be worth it enough for Poland to agree to it for its 5%. And that's assuming the economies stay even. As I said earlier on, that the EU may well be getting an influx of businesses, in response to Gary's question about the personnel shift, the educated youth shift out. Businesses will not stay in the UK if they then have to pay extra to go to Europe, when they could move to Europe and have to pay only the same kinds of extras to go into the small market that is the UK. So it may be that businesses may be leaving the UK to go to Poland, and therefore shifting that balance of exports, so that Britain be producing less itself internally and then having to import more, raising its desire and need for a thing, and it may be going to countries like Poland and stuff, which then has less need to trade with the UK, because say 1% of what it's sent to the UK, or is buying from the UK, is now being made locally. So that's going to be the big problem, and that's Poland, and that's one of the better ones. I mean, sure, France, Ireland have good trading with us. We can do a deal with them, probably okay. We've got good relations with them. Gibraltar. Now, if Gibraltar's a sticking point, Spain may be a bit of a bastard. Spain's wanted Gibraltar for decades, centuries maybe, but if we stop being a bit of a bastard and it's saying, get away from Spain, and it could end up coming to almost to the point of armed guards at the border, leering menacingly across at the Spanish armed guards who are leering back, then it could be that any deal that gets Spanish approval is going to be brutal for the UK. And that's not going to work out well either. So this idea that we're just going to get a trade agreement, it's going to be fine. It's a good idea if you're saying it to Gavin and Wayne down at the pub, but in reality, it's not going to come out as easily as you might think it would. But that's something that was conveniently forgotten to be mentioned. 5 years, at best, assuming a good, easy agreement, is going to leave a huge dent still in the UK economy until then. But it's not going to be the sunshine and rainbows and kittens and unicorns. So that's going to be a little bit of a challenge that, again, the Leave people are going to have to suddenly wake up and deal with. And of course, at the same time, the UK, on the upside, the UK pound, the British pound has dropped in value, but which means that imports are going to be more expensive because your dollar is going to buy more pounds, which means at the same time your pound buys less dollars. So what did cost $5 and therefore what £3.20 or so, is now going to cost maybe £3.80. And the same with euros. I mean, sure, it's going to be cheaper to buy if you're in Europe. It's going to be cheaper to buy from the UK because of thing, but at the same time, the UK is going to have to buy at a more expensive rate from the EU, which is again not going to help the economy, because the UK imports a lot of stuff from Europe. I mean, if we didn't, there wouldn't be the need for all the ferries, and there wouldn't be the need for the big freight trains of the Channel Tunnel. So that is going to be a big sticking point, I think, and people just have underestimated so thoroughly the effect of leave on the economy, because people don't think in terms of economy. Um, it reminds me of a passage from my one of my favourite authors, Sir Terry Pratchett, in Night Watch. In it, there's a siege, and they blocked the gates around the city of Ankh-Morpork, and people said to many leaders, food and drink's just something that servants bring, but elsewhere, people are trying to bring food and drink into the country, into the city, and they can't because the gates are barred, and so very soon the city's going to run dry of food. But I say to the leaders, food is something that servants bring. It isn't something that has to be imported in and put onto store shelves and go out to buy, and so there's going to be shortages. And that's not something people think about right now. They want oranges or lemons or something. They just go down to Tesco or Sainsbury's or Waitrose and go down and buy them, and then these kumquats aren't the best. They were bloody Europeans. But the fact is, they have to come from places like Europe and things, and they've got to come in post this date. Now, with a leave, they're not going to get the easy access. It's going to cost more. It's going to be harder to get. There are going to be more restrictions on getting them because the EU smoothed over all of these things. There's a great analogy in many ways to the United States. I've been to the States to buy things, and it was fairly easy. I mean, I went with a friend about 10 years ago. We drove down to Tallahassee from Atlanta, and he wanted to buy a car. He bought a '63 Ford Galaxy. We drove down to Tallahassee. We signed the paperwork. We bought it. We drove it back up. Not a problem. I went to another friend. A couple of months later, we went to Salisbury, North Carolina, to buy some Lexan. We went over there. We bought the Lexan, loaded it in my van, brought it all the way back. Not a problem. Different states, they all have different rules, regulations, sets of laws, tax rates, etc. But because it's part of a union, it was easy enough to cross the border, and effectively there was a free movement of goods from one state to the next, much like the EU. If I'd wanted to go buy it from Mexico or Canada, that would have been a different prospect. I'd had to have got all this paperwork and signed her over and customs and etc. And that's one way for Americans to maybe think about what this Brexit deal does. It changes it from a sort of interstate trading thing to an international thing, and that's a lot harder to deal with just everyday wise. And now look at the chat, and thank you, Gary. What a great birthday present I got, huh? But let's see. Is there anything else? Oh, democracy. Yes, we were talking about the democracy as well earlier, but the idea that the EU is less democratic is perhaps one of the more bold-faced lies. Again, as I say, there are two chambers in the European, in the EU, and there's the like the council and stuff, and and the parliament, as I say, is elected by a proportional representation system, but the council and the commissioners all come from the democratically elected members of the member governments. So if you don't like, if you're saying you don't like the EU because of it's undemocratic compared to the UK, then remember one half, the MEPs, are elected in a more democratic way than UK MPs are elected, and the other half is elected by those people that you elected in the way you think is more democratic, although it isn't. And by comparison, the UK has, as I say, this plurality-based small district MP first past the post system for the lower house, and the upper house is completely unelected. It's a House of Lords. Um, so that's another one of those funny lies, and the lies cropped up time and time again. Um, Again, Nigel Farage, the British Grinch in many ways. Um, can't be seen without a pint in his hand, yet he was on the EU Fisheries Commission. Fishing rights were a big flavour of his campaign. They sent boats up the Thames and stuff, and EU fishing rights and quotas and limits and stuff were a big issue in many parts of the country around this Leave vote, and how they're letting the Spanish get away with fishing and running off our fish and stuff. But Mr. Farage was on the EU Fisheries Commission. He attended 1 out of the 41 votes. He didn't actually care to do anything about it when he had a chance and ability to do anything about it. He'd rather stay in the UK, draw his money for going to the European Parliament, siphoning money out of the EU that Britain has to pay for, while at the same time complaining that nothing's being done in Europe and by the EU, partly because he's not doing anything. It's his own inaction that he's complaining about, and his own inability to influence it by choice. So, coming up to an hour and 10 minutes, so I think I've covered about everything I can think of, unless there are any more questions from anybody else. Anybody else at all? If not, well then, I'll thank you for watching, and I may try this again at a later date with a hopefully a more engaging and upbeat topic, because this has certainly been incredibly depressing last night. I very nearly went and drank a bottle of vodka instead to try and drown my sorrows, as I suspect many people are right now that the cold reality has set in. And I hope my voice, and I thank those of you at the staff for the issues with the audio recording and the audio. It turns out my headset microphone, this thing here, wasn't working so well, so I had to grab the old standby. And I hope that the sound came out fine for you. Obviously I can't hear what I'm saying and how it comes across, because that gets some nasty feedback going. But I thank you all, and if you want to hear more from me, find me at Tetch on Twitter and on Facebook and everywhere else pretty much, and on my website at tetch.co.uk. And I thank you all for coming, and if I may resort back to my Scouse roots for a moment or two, thanks for all, and you have a good day like